It's time for another vinyl review from yours truly, Russ Shaw. Momentary Lapse of Reason by Pink Floyd. The only other review I could find of this was a guy in the UK who didn't like it as much as I do. But this is the American, as a bloke from the US of A here, wearing my Jimi Hendrix shirt. Born and raised here in the Seattle area, much like myself. Made some of his best music. All of his best music in the UK. So, as a Seattle music fan, love UK, love the Floyd and the many, many awesome bands that come from across the pond, as it were. But yeah, that explains my Hendrix shirt a little bit during doing this review. Momentary Lapse of Reason, 1987 this album came out. And the previous album before this was in 1983. So it had been a while. Roger Waters, David Gilmour, Nick Mason. This is the names, the three names on the back of this CD, the final cut. The last Pink Floyd record with Roger Waters. Now, when this album was released, that was the big controversy. Yeah, but is it Pink Floyd? Is that what it is? Because Roger Waters was no longer, didn't want to be in Pink Floyd anymore, didn't want to be in the band, and actually sued for them to not use this name. There was a huge lawsuit going on, storm of legal saber rattling about from Gilmour's people to Waters' people, and David Gilmour started recording this. Gilmour, Richard Wright, and Nick Mason. So that's the three names on this record here, all right? So no Roger Waters, Richard Wright, who sadly passed away in 2008, and Nick Mason. Now, I'm reviewing the 1987 version of this album, so that's kind of coming out. I've listened to it a few times. I haven't totally broke the cellophane yet, but I had to spin it. I just had to, more than once. But this is the pure 87 first release of this. In 2019, they released a stripped down. They took away a lot of the effects, a lot of this got a lot of critics upset. Yeah, they didn't like this. It was too 80s is what they called it. Like, this was just too industrial. That's another interesting part of this this review, is how technology in 1987 affected creativity with this album, and they just using a lot of things and tweaking a lot of stuff and trying out some things because of technology. Did that make this album less valuable to the ears of Floyd fans that came along in the 80s, for example, like myself? I love Pink Floyd. I bought the Wall used. It came out in 1979. I was 11 years old when that album came out. But this album, I remember 1987. I remember when this was being played on the radio. And for the 80s, I even remember some of the controversy, right? Is this a David Gilmour solo album? You know, I mean, that's kind of a slap in the face to Nick Mason and Richard Wright, isn't it? Pink Floyd has been a band with numerous members over the years, right? It's not just, it's funny that they put the three names on here and the three names on here, but Pink Floyd isn't like Green Day. You know, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of musicians that come together to create this art. A lot of songwriters as well. Pink Floyd's effect on me personally, I heard an interview. There's a podcast I listened to with David Gilmour. I'll put a link in the description. Really good. But him talking about Floyd's themes over the years being that of destiny and time, which I find really interesting. Was this album going to be a deviation from some of that heart that Roger Waters and David Gilmour had as guys who were creative pioneers, really, of the time? Gilmour said, he started writing Sorrow, and that song kind of had this creative energy that had the rest of the project just sort of flowed out of. And Waters being calling lawyers, right? Getting the legal teams on one another. This is why the album was recorded in LA. So Gilmour talking about having the creative energy and headspace and time to create this album on the West Coast in Los Angeles, while all the legal offices in the UK were closed, halfway around the world. The operating business hours in the UK for lawyers and courts and such was not interfering with the recording schedule in Los Angeles, which I thought was really interesting in a way to creatively avoid some pressure. And me personally, going back to the 80s sound, that's when this was recorded, And again, as a Gen X guy who grew up on the 80s music, saying that it's too 80s, I guess listening to it, there's some of that weird percussion thing that they did, like electronic tweakery they did with the drums back then. Like, for example, in the song Dire Straits, I want my MTV. At the beginning of that track, you got that drum, that percussion that's very auto-tuned drums, kind of, it sounds like, which today is sort of weird, and you got some of that in here. So I'm curious to hear this stripped down version of this record that they released. I guess they released in 2019. They may be doing another one here, I hear, possibly. Is that a rumor? I don't know. Is it an official word that Record Store Day, Black Friday, or 2022 may have another remix or re-release of this album? And I'm curious, and I haven't not heard the stripped down version, so I'm curious. But I still really love this album, even with the 80s stuff, because for me, I don't have a problem with that. Like, it's, again, that's the time it came out. These different musical influences, the way time affects an album's birthing out is interesting. This will always be this album's first birth, right? And it was birthed out in the 80s. Speaking of destiny and time, as far as the creative wizards behind the music would elaborate on that, I'm sure. I'd love to hear it. Here's something else I found. My wife and I went to a couple of used record stores in Seattle, Daybreak Records and Fat Cat Records, looking for some used cool finds. And amongst the paperwork and books and things, I found this, which is really cool. Speaking of a momentary lapse of reason, this is the tour book. Pink Floyd World Tour. How cool is that? And speaking of there being a lot of moving parts in the tour, a lot more than 3 guys. This is everybody, though. This is like all the credits of who is Pink Floyd, right? I mean, wow. Amazing. Would have loved to seen that show. I did not. There they are. Now, in the remix from 2019, they, Richard Wright's not with them anymore, right? So there was a lot of trickery that they did. Even Gilmour, I hear, went into some of the vocals. Like, there's some vocals that were in this studio recording that he didn't like as much as some of the stuff that he recorded live. So they actually took old live recorded material from both Nick Mason, you know, and Richard Wright, because he wasn't there to re-record any of this stuff, and the vocals of Gilmour, and mixed it together to create that stripped down sound. Speaking of technology, right? Like, this is amazing stuff. I'm excited to hear that record. It's not, I couldn't find it on streaming anywhere. So the music for me, how did this music affect me in 1987? I mean, just some of the songs on this album. On the Turning Away is probably one of my favorite songs of all time. Probably. It is. It's in there. The two hits. So Gilmour was experimenting with some new songwriters, or bringing some other songwriters in to crank out some of these songs. Eric Stewart, Roger McGough, hope I'm pronouncing that right, and Anthony Moore. Now, Anthony Moore wrote the two songs, On the Turning Away and Learning to Fly. Those are the two songs that were on the Billboard charts. Our rock and roll radio station here in the Seattle area, KISW, had those songs. Learning to Fly, I mean, it was pop music back then. That's another critique of this album. It's like, oh, it's pop music when, you know, The Wall was not so much pop music. And a lot of the Waters fans don't like this album. And I don't know, man, I'll tell you, I love Roger Waters. I love Dark Side of the Moon. I love The Wall. It's one of the greatest albums ever. That album touched me immensely. Just the message of the wall, and this metaphor of the wall, the walls that people help us put up, whether it's your mother, right? That's one of the songs on the album, or school, abusive teachers, and just all of this imagery around the dark figures in our lives that help us create the walls that kind of keep us secure or insecure, as it were. As a guy who struggled with addiction myself, The Wall was a huge kind of a wake-up call sort of piece of music, where you see a person, the film kind of depicted a lot of this, but just the music itself, getting to that point where, you know, spoiler alert, right? Tear down this wall. You know, it's protected you long enough. Why do people stay strung out and addicted? It's just another brick in the wall. And for all of the hate around this album, I don't know, man, it's still better than this album. Right? I like this album. All right, I do. I love Roger Waters. Some of his stuff with the military and just the time that came out in '83 during the Cold War. Here's a fun fact. I lived on a place called Adak, Alaska. I bought this album when it came out. Adak, Alaska was closer, still is, closer to mainland Russia than it is to Anchorage. We lived on a military base, a Navy base, in the middle of the Bering Sea, basically, during the Cold War. 1983, when this album came out. And even in 87, you got Dogs of War is a great track on this album. Signs of Life, there's just so much good stuff. Yet Another Movie, which points to some of the artistry on this world tour and on the record. Just a lot of, right? This is really cool. I was glad to get my hands on this. I was, because I've been thinking about doing this review for a while, and then I find this in a stack of old stuff. It's just really cool. Floyd playing. Here's some more folks that put together Pink Floyd at the time. An amazing, I'm going to say it, it's just an amazing record. And for all the controversy, September 8th, 1987, this album was released, and Christmas Eve, 1987, Roger Waters and David Gilmour actually came to an agreement and signed some legal paperwork on Gilmour's houseboat, all right? So not more than a few months later. There's a lot of this legal stuff was blown out of proportion in this feud that they had. In 2013, Roger Waters, Rolling Stone had reported, and I'll put a link in the description for that too, that Roger Waters regrets suing his bandmates, Pink Floyd, back in 1987 when this album was released, which I find interesting as well. As he's gotten older, he admitted, yeah, that was probably not good form. Save that sticker on the front, because this, I've seen used copies of this, and they were still pretty expensive, so, but the used copies of first releases don't fold open like this one, and folds open like this. There's that photo again from the tour book, picture of the boat, and there's the date right there, September 1987, 34 years ago. That's another thing, independent release. Momentary Lapse of Reason. So if the wall, you know, for me personally, the wall being the point at which all the walls come down, the rock bottom moment, the being exposed moment, and this album is learning to fly, you know, afterwards. Signs of life, right? On the turning away from the pain and down trouble. Just a great album. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these, hit the like button, subscribe, follow the playlist. I'll be doing more of these if you guys enjoy them. But I love the music. Love the vinyl is back. All this artwork, and right? Do you remember when this album came out? Do you like this album? I'd be interested in hearing from you what you think about A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Later. Oh, here's some other reviews I've done, if you want to click on those as well. Check them out. My sticker. Yeah, but is it Pink Floyd? Is that what it is? Dana, is it Pink Floyd? Without Roger Waters? It is. I think it is. Of course it is.